great to see you all today, and really I have a great honor of chairing one of hopefully the most exciting sessions of this conference. The topics, as you can see, are hyperconnectivity and technological disruption, whether they're going to provide hope, whether they're going to provide excitement, or whether they're just going to be controversial remains to be seen. In confidence, I can tell you that I'm joined by a most amazing panel, and if you haven't had a chance to look at their bios, you definitely should. But before inviting them to the stage, let me take a couple of minutes to set the expectations for this session from kind of my perspective. And I'll cover 4 things. I'll cover the format, the tone, the perspectives, and importantly, the reference point for our conversation. In terms of the format, I'll be inviting shortly each of the panelists to make a couple of points, a couple of remarks to get the thinking going. And then in the second part of the conversation, we'll move to have an on-the-couch or on the armchair conversation where we can explore those things in a little bit more detail. Given that we're talking about technology, given that we're talking about innovation, we really want to make this session very interactive. So the challenge for you all is to start texting those questions as the speakers go through things. So that's in terms of the format. In terms of the tone, technology, something is happening here. In terms of the tone, technology is a much hyped about topic. So we'll hope to bring some energy but some vigor to the conversation, to quote Bill English. And we may veer at times towards the provocative and the controversial, but hopefully that is a good thing in the context of our topic. In terms of the perspective of the conversation, we'll do a bit of horizon scanning with Chris. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to be part of the new exciting world with Sarah. And we'll also, importantly, look at the implications for the public sector with Colin. Finally, the last point in terms of expectations is that reference point for our conversation. And I think it's important to highlight this because not only it's in relation to the conversation about technology or about this session, but generally speaking, much broader than that. And that is that the most important reference point for our conversation should be the user. And sometimes, whether the user is the customer or the consumer or the client or the citizen or the participant or the taxpayer or the citizen, whatever we call it, they are the ones that matter, and we should keep that in mind. Now, I do so, and we've been doing, and some of you will know, we've been doing this research program in as far as the user is the Australian public, and they deal with government services. And we've been running this research program for 5 years now, and let me tell you, quite a number of things have changed in terms of what users want and what users expect from government. But in the context of this session, that expectation around digital and technology is only getting bigger. Now, when we look at the other side of the fence, in the public sector, the feedback is that currently there are significant barriers for any organization that is attempting anything remotely resembling a digital transformation agenda. And these things are not new, and they're probably well known to you all. But to add a little bit more complexity to the operating environment, there are a number of things, a number of changes that surround us all. And those changes are relentless. And at the most basic, they're driven by exponential growth in computing power, Moore's law, and nowadays by exponential growth in data. And then those two combined make for amazing technology developments, which in turn start affecting the economy, have changes in society, and finally, and importantly for each and everyone in the room, affect us as users or as public servants. So, if we're considering this to be just kind of the baseline of the operating environment for the public sector, what else is out there to kind of get us a little bit more complexity? Well, to hear about that, please join me in welcoming Chris Veen, who is a true agent of change and has been driving innovation in places such as the World Bank and the White House. Chris.
I don't oftentimes get the opportunity to actually participate in a conference that I'm speaking at. And so this has just been a fantastic opportunity, and I want to thank you for letting me in and hearing and seeing some amazing things, some amazing energy. It also feels like I'm coming home. I have been coming to Australia for a good 10 years now and have gotten to know many of you and count you as my friends. So again, thank you for having me. Peter Diamandis is a futurist. Peter also is a technologist. He helped to found or fund the Singularity University and X Prize Foundation. And Peter is famous for talking about the time of abundance, that we live in a time of abundance, that technology is actually converting deficit to abundance, that technology is the way that we can actually add fundamental, continuous value to the organization. Take science, for example. A good friend of mine in his recent book, The Industries of the Future, said that the first $1 trillion industry in the world was based on ones and zeros. The next $1 trillion industry is going to be based on genomic code, your genes and my genes. Or the fact in terms of technology that the chief information officer for the UN is quoted as saying roughly that the last innovation that humankind will make will be artificial intelligence, that all future innovation will be because of artificial intelligence. Or this idea of innovation, one of the most overused, poorly misunderstood words on the planet at the moment, but the idea that people can create technologies like cryptocurrencies and blockchain open ledger systems as a means of disruption only to be subverted and taken by the very powers that they were supposed to disrupt and actually use them to create more control and a more efficient system. But I would argue, and back to the session that we just had, it's entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship that takes this raw goodness that we've seen in science and technology and innovation and actually applies it, actually makes a public good, and that's the beauty. And Sarah's going to talk about this a lot more. But it's intrapreneurship, entrepreneurship that will, in the end, prove out whether we were successful with this grand experiment called democracy. Now, this is an example of a Tasmanian company, and Greg, good to see you. It's been a while since we had a chat. How's that open data going?
Still going, Chris.
Oh, good. But Roz comes from Tasmania, and what she has done is actually created a small company that's using internet technology, sensors, and she's actually solving problems of farmers, starting in Tasmania, but the rest of Australia and the rest of the world. This is the future of what technology means. This is converting abundance into wealth. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but I'm going to take a different perspective on the Great Rebellion, which we just talked about. And I'm going to approach it from a technology standpoint and say that I believe we're approaching the fourth industrial revolution. Every technology or every other industrial revolution has been affected by a technology of some sort. This one is going to be the mother of all revolutions because we are now to the point that we can integrate and combine human and machine thinking into something that's being called conscious technology. It will fundamentally alter and change everything that we know today. The impact of this is already being felt in countries like my home country, the United States, because we're starting to see jobless recovery. It is making the system much more efficient, much more effective. You simply don't need the number of people to do the work that you used to or that you currently do. And that, to me, is what's creating this. Because what we are perceiving, and it's people of my generation, it's middle-aged white men who are unable to conceive of a future that they can't control, can't understand, and are desperate for anybody to keep the status quo where it is, and he has figured it out. What an amazing con man this man is. He has actually figured out how to present and sell the idea that the United States can return to some mythical point in the past that never really existed. What do we have to do? Well, I told you I hate the word innovation, but I'm going to say we're going to have to innovate innovation. And what you really can't see is in that graphic an organization called the State Department, the United States State Department, who actually came to Silicon Valley and convened an amazing group of people to discuss how we deal with weapons of mass destruction. Heretofore, something that was never talked about outside of secured environments and SCIFs and whatever. But what has happened because of technology is not only the tools, but the thinking and the understanding that open systems are actually much more effective than closed systems. So what do? How do we take and move from an existing model into a new model? And I would say we have to unbundle the existing value proposition of government, which we'll get to during discussion. We then need to digitally rethink the model. Too often, and including people of my ilk, we start with technology. You never, ever start with technology. You always start with the problem and then figure out how technology can actually improve the model, if you will. And then monetize the change. Monetize, oftentimes in the public sector, means how do you save money and how do you apply it in different ways? This is, Jack has such beautiful slides, Jack. I want your graphic artist. I was dependent on PowerPoint and came up with this. And let me just say back to the former conversation, as much as things change, they stay the same. And while this reflects a different operating model for public service, in many respects, it is what the previous panel was talking about, of just simply capturing what works, but using new tools and new approaches. So I would argue that, and social business and social media is teaching us, that we have to start with the community first. We have to be worried about delivery first. And then we move into the change, the platform, and getting policy. As Mike Bracken said, somewhat famously, in an analog world, policy dictates delivery. In a digital world, delivery informs policy. What's happened as a result of technology is that we've had to swap the logical order of how policy is created. We are innovating policy by, in fact, turning it on its head. And there are 3 examples here that I could talk about. Sarah, are you talking about the Innovation Exchange? Sarah and I are on the advisory committee to Foreign Minister Julie Bishop on creating the Innovation Exchange in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Let me just say that you Australians are incredibly giving. You give $4+ billion every year in foreign aid. The challenge is that we don't necessarily know if it's working. And what Foreign Minister wanted to do was figure out a different way to do that, and she knew enough to not do a wholesale change, but to create a safe space, a lab, if you will, that change could be addressed, could be touched, should be created, could be discussed, and not have negative impact on the system until the system was ready for the change. Innovation Exchange is amazing. Peter was part of that. Had many discussions with Peter around how that got implemented, gets implemented in DFAT, and we can talk about that some more. But I would argue, back to the first point in community delivery, that it's actually one of the most important things to open up the policymaking process. When I was at the White House, the traditional rules-making organizations were fighting with their counterparts in China, like this. And the president looked at this with some dismay and said, there has to be a different way. There has to be a new way of solving these problems. And he turned to my bosses actually, the science advisor to the president and the technology advisor to the president, and said, make a difference. Try something, I don't care what it is, but just try something different in this policy malaise that we have. And what we did is that we figured out what the Chinese most wanted was our innovation. And what we figured out is that we needed to not close Silicon Valley off or any of the other tech or industry partners around the country, but open it up and actually show that what they want would actually not happen if they didn't open it up to a democratic point of reference. And it worked. A very specific policy change on the Chinese side was taken away as a result, a direct result, simply of going to the community first rather than starting with policy. And I would argue that that's what's happening in New South Wales in the Family and Community Service Center with my good friend Dr. Ian Opperman, who's actually using data to figure out how to innovate every step in the way in the family system. If I had to capture, I guess, what all of this means, is that what we've learned is that we need to create a platform. It needs to be a place. It needs to be a place that captures human networks and a little bit of capital, but that is used to create the engine. That the engine has been created or helped by democratized access to information. As much as I necessarily don't like social media as well, social business, social relations is the new core of the model. There's no question about that. So what we need to do is figure out how to connect to the massive amount of knowledge that's around the world. We need to challenge the people around the world to be able to work on that, to collaborate, so that we can find, test, and scale the solution. The last year of the World Bank, I traveled 340,000 air miles, visiting countries after country after country. And this model captures the best, the brightest, the work of what's happening around the world. So what does it take? I am a recovering civil servant. I was Chief Information Officer for the City and County of San Francisco for 5 years. Before that, I was in the White House. I've served 4 presidents, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Very interesting, those 2. Been in the World Bank and watched its arguable collapse right now. And what I've learned is that it always, always, always starts with people. And what the Obama administration is doing is actually figuring out that change is happening so rapidly that, at least in the federal government of the US, there's an inability to keep up. That we have to allow and invite the outside in and work together. And what he's doing is actually creating startups within every federal agency and inviting people from Silicon Valley or New York or wherever it is in and marrying them with committed civil servants to create a better environment, to create new and creative ideas that may not have happened without the influx of an engineering rather than a political science background. The other is that the operating model, if you will, of what we need to do needs to be flipped. And we need to be worrying about co-creation and participation and let the network do the work for us. What the internet, what technology has basically done is multiplied the possibility of solving problems by allowing us to access every single person on the planet. That is fundamentally reshaping democracy. It's fundamentally reshaping politics in the United States. And Obama understood that. Obama created an amazing campaign apparatus that understood this. It's less clear that the current Democratic candidate does. But basically, the second requirement is that we need to flip our operating model and be about the community first. And the last is that we need to be worried about experience innovation. I read the Mandarin. What wonderful articles in there about design thinking, agile. Every buzzword, every concept is actually being discussed in the Mandarin, and somebody's doing it here. Somebody's doing it in the United States. The problem that I have is that everybody's trying it, but no one is really succeeding. We have, in this space, an execution dilemma. I have no doubt that every one of you in this room is committed, but yet we talk about this stuff over and over and over again, and oftentimes it just doesn't happen. There is an inertia that prevents it from actually taking place. Peter Diamandis, I'm going to end with this, is famous also for saying, the best way to predict the future is to shape it now. And the Pope, in one of his earlier treatises, basically says, don't do it half-assed. What we have to do is rethink the future, one experiment at a time based on experience, and grow it. I can talk about all these fancy terms, I can talk about all these fancy technologies, but when it comes down to it, it is change management. It is figuring out how to use crisis and everything that the academics have been talking about and writing about for years. It all boils down to change management enabled by technology. And that's true whether you're in Africa, Asia, South America, North America, it doesn't matter. What I've described today is universal. It is the state of the state, if you will, of change and of change management enabled by technology. Thank you.